Hello, good evening and welcome to the Hot Seat. Our next guest tonight is a man who spent a lifetime in politics, accounting, central banking and music too. And tonight he's in the Hot Seat. Good evening, Ajit Niwad Kabra.
Good evening, Faraz.
Thank you for being in the Hot Seat.
Thank you. It's not too hot, but I like it.
Okay. Do you agree, when you left the central bank, did you leave a robust economy?
Well, I think that's what lots of people say, and I would agree with that. Particularly even international media, including the FT in London, mentioned that when I'm leaving a robust economy to my successor. The macro fundamentals at that time were pretty strong. Growth at a strong 7.5%, 7.6%. Inflation at record lows for nearly 6 years. We had reserves of about $8.2 billion, sufficient for about 5 months of imports.
That's when you left?
At the time I left, yes. Right. Then, of course, we had the rupee at a strong level, where the rupee was, as against almost all the currencies in the world, including the US dollar, had been performing very well. In fact, the last year, 2014, it had a depreciation of only about 0.15%
right,
against the dollar. So a pretty strong economy. Growth was good, confidence levels were high, lots of projects were going on, massive number of investments were coming in. We had about $6 billion from outside in treasury bills, treasury bonds and international bonds. So there was a lot of confidence from outside. The stock market was doing well. It was performing at about 7,600 points at that time. So I think overall the world would acknowledge, they have to acknowledge, that we were leaving behind a pretty strong economy.
So the public obviously didn't vote the former president out on the basis of underperforming economy.
I wouldn't agree with that. It's certainly not underperforming economy. It was the best performing economy in the South Asian region and perhaps in Asia. And that's not what I say. Many of the reports that come out internationally, where various investment banks were having various comparisons, they used to say that.
And Mr. Cabral, at the present time, there's an ambience of accusing the other side, so to speak, of various sort of shortcomings, for want of a better word. Can you say, and you've been part of a lot of this controversy. They seem to be throwing many stones. Did you ever deviate from established procedures at the central bank in terms of procurement and investment?
I have been always a person who has advocated good governance. In fact, the best corporate report and accounts committee and the good governance report that came out from the Institute of Chartered Accountants way back in 1993 was authored by me. And I have served in the SEC, in the Institute of Chartered Accountants as the president. And right along, I think all my peers know what kind of enthusiasm I've had for good governance. So during the period that I was in the central bank also, not only did we practice good governance procedures in the central bank, we also inculcated those in the banks as well. And we brought in compulsory codes of best practice and governance for the banks. And I would think that we had a very strong culture of compliance. The central bank has some very good people who, if they are given the space to work independently, they would do so. And I think if you talk to any one of the central banking persons during my period, they would vouch for the fact that I had given them that space. They had the freedom to act independently, as well as acting in accordance with the decisions that they would have to take professionally, as well as with the expertise that they have. And I would say that we have given that space, and as a result, we have been very confident that the procedures had been followed.
And so would you describe yourself as having been a very hands-on governor?
I would say that I was very keen about my work. The day I left, some of the people who spoke at that meeting said that I was one of the governors who had taken a lot of trouble to learn, to absorb the work of the central bank. You know, we have 25 different departments,
right,
and many of those departments are bigger than the biggest corporates in our country.
yes.
So in order to be able to absorb, you got to study carefully. And I think it was heartening for me to realize that it was appreciated by many of my colleagues at the central bank, that they appreciated the fact that I had been keen to study. And I would say that it was a great learning experience for me, and I was hands-on in that sense.
Yeah.
I've also respected the top guys at the central bank. They've been well trained, they are brilliant people, and all of them had been giving me very good advice as well. And we had a very good partnership going, and I would say hands-on as well as sufficient space for the experts to perform. And that's the type of administration that I had during that period.
So how easy was it to you in this ambience, or in Sri Lanka, where generally the underlings don't do anything without the boss saying so? So in that sort of, within that culture, how easy was it for you to get something done which was your, let's say, your baby, your little thing? You wanted to get something done. How easy was that?
That's an interesting question for us. I think what we did was we left the my and the I part out.
Right.
We always did a we.
Right.
We had strategic planning exercises where the top people of the central bank went in together, and we developed the plans. And from 2006 onwards, if you can see that we had one of the best cultures of corporate planning in our country, and perhaps in many parts of the world. And those documents are available for everyone to see, and those were prepared not by experts from outside.
Right.
Those were prepared by the in-house top guys at the central bank itself.
Right.
So that gave a feeling of inclusion,
Right.
and that it was not Cabral's plan, it was our plan. Of course, I also contributed to it. It's the same way that many others contributed as well. So it was a holistic approach that we took. It was something that people could relate to. It was their own plan, and I think that really was the key to ensuring that we had a collective vision, and we had the ability to collectively implement the plans that we had ourselves prepared. That, I would think, was the way that we moved, and that was the key to the success that we had in the last several years.
So did the Rajapaksa administration, was their economic policy one based around spend, spend, spend?
I would say was based on invest, invest and invest.
Right.
Not only invest by the government, invest by the private sector, invest by outsiders in our country. So there was a huge effort that was made to ensure that the confidence levels were maintained. That is why for us, when we go to the markets and when we have an international bond issue, if Sri Lanka says we want $1 billion, we used to have people coming and saying we want to take parts of it, and then sometimes it was oversubscribed 7 to 10 times.
Right.
So there was such a lot of demand for the Sri Lankan paper, particularly because they had confidence in the economy. They had also seen our track record, where we have been able to bring all the macro fundamentals to proper levels, good levels. You know, in 2006, when I started as the governor, Sri Lanka had a per capita income of just about $1,200.
Right.
But when I left, we had a per capita income of nearly $3,800. So it took us 56 years of independence to come to $1,000.
Right.
And when President Rajapaksa took office in 2005, it had only gone up from 1,000 to 1,200.
Right.
But from 2006 onwards, it was a sharp drive upwards, notwithstanding the war. We had money for the war, we had money for investment. So we had all those investments in our country. Sometimes people are puzzled as to how it was done.
Yes,
they ask me that.
How was it done?
It was done because we had a plan, we executed it meticulously, we ensured that people were all on board, and that plans were implemented as well. Now, any plan you can scuttle, not with force from outside. You just pull the plug out of the money.
Right.
If you stop the funding for a project,
Yeah.
the project is gone. But you would see that during that period, there were so many projects that were going on. Not only the infrastructure development projects,
Yeah.
but also projects that were for security, for the humanitarian effort. All those were massive projects which we needed huge funds.
Right.
So if someone takes a little step back and sees, okay, how did these guys do that? How did they have money for investment, for development? How did they have money for fighting a war? How did they have money for all this? And then the redevelopment after the war. So we were keen to see that all those were planned meticulously and each one had a role to play.
Right.
And that's how it was done, and I believe the people will recognize after some time if these projects do not go through.
Yeah.
That is not because the people who are implementing it are weak, but because they may not be having enough funds. So it's a dual
dual track?
situation, dual track. You have to have the money, you have to have the people, you have to have the projects. So that was the key to the Rajapaksa's administration, and we were keen to see that the projects that were identified were propelled, and the public sector was also given the space to do the projects that they also wanted to do.
I think the detractors of that would say, may venture to say that this was obtained by selling or mortgaging our soul to the Chinese.
That's an interesting question once again for us. You see, at different periods of history in the world, there are different countries who are at the forefront of investment. At one time it was the US. At one time it was Britain. At one time it was Japan. At one time it was Germany. In the 1500s it was Portugal. So different times of history, there were different countries which had the strength and the muscle to make investments outside. Today it is China's turn. We got to admit that. China has the strength and the funds and the ability to make investments all over the world. The others do not have that amount of ability right now. I don't know how it will be later on. So working with China is important. And at the same time, Sri Lanka never closed its doors for other investment from outside. Whether it was loans or investment or foreign direct investment, it never closed doors to anyone. Doors were open. Some of the projects that were done by the Chinese were originally mooted with maybe Japanese funding or with US funding. But it changed after some time, and there were many projects that the Chinese did. And I think that trend will continue for another couple of decades. I don't know for sure, but it appears so. So Chinese had the investments and so did the others.
You just a few moments ago you mentioned how attractive in your tenure the Sri Lanka paper, the bonds were in overseas markets and so on. By upsetting the Chinese in terms of the Colombo Port City project, for example, this is don't you think that this administration is treading on pretty thin ice?
The way I would see it for us is that when governments enter into agreements, it is a sovereign agreement. Once that is done, the subsequent governments also have to honor those. I'm not talking about a particular project only.
Right.
That is the way that you build confidence in an economy or in the in a government's word. Now, if you take, for example, a long-term bond that we would issue, say an international bond of 10 years. Now we issued one last year. And that bond was issued for a period of 10 years, $1.5 billion. Now, the investors must be certain that whichever government comes subsequently, that this investment will be safeguarded, and come 10 years, they would get paid. Now, that is the bedrock on which confidence is established, which ensures that foreign investment comes into a country. Now, the moment you disturb that, you have other complications arising. If you have people debating as to whether a particular word of a government could subsequently be disturbed by another government for good reason, bad reason, or any reason.
Right.
Then these questions surface.
Right.
So we've got to put our inside house in order. That's up to us. I mean, if you have some areas where you have to do better, those have to be done. I will be the first to admit that. But with the outside party who has based a decision on the word as well as the bond of a government, they should be freed from that anxiety. And if they are freed from that anxiety only, you will find other people coming in. If that is not done, you would find that the tendency for people to come from outside and invest in a country will be weakened. Take for example, if we were investing outside, let's say you invest some money outside and you find that after some time that country is having problems with outside investors. The next time you go, you will be a little wary, or you may not go at all. So that's the danger that we need to to deal with. So I would think that in the interests of governance, we got to certainly review certain clauses if we have to, but unilaterally taking decisions is sometimes not the best way forward.
Our Prime Minister says that this House is actually not in order. And he said in Parliament a few days ago that in terms of this, the present controversy about this Treasury bond for 30 years, he said that he wanted, I think his words were, I wanted a public auction and not a private placement, as was the case in the past, meaning clearly under your tenure. So, is this true? Did you have private placements and did you forget all about public auctions?
I can assure you that the Public Debt Department is a department which is very, very well organized, and they have auctions that they conduct in a very transparent manner, and those have been put in place by experts in the field, and we have not had any instance of any person crying foul in the last so many years that I was there as a governor. And at the same time, for us, the connotation that people use as private placements is not really the right word that they use. You see, there is a way that once an auction is over and you have not taken the full amount that you require, you can ask the primary dealers of the people who are making the investments in the treasury bills and treasury bonds to subscribe for further amounts. But in those instances, I can assure you that the Public Debt Department always says we will issue it at the weighted average rate that prevailed at the auction.
So the weighted average rate that prevailed is calculated amongst the ones that have been confirmed as taken up?
Absolutely.
Right.
So once you have confirmed that you are taking so much, then the weighted average rate is established, and that is not established only by the central bank. Anyone who is in the market can see that. Then they know what the weighted average is. And when the central bank requests what you term as private placements, they're actually not private in that sense. It's only I suppose the word private comes because it is opened out to the primary dealers who work in tandem with the market to make investments. But the rate by that time is established. So sometimes the rate can be less than even the highest rate that went into the primary bill auction or the primary bond auction. So in that way, I think it's a question of terminology. And during my period, that was the procedure that was followed, which was established by the Public Debt Department. And I think it not only prevails in Sri Lanka, but to my mind, in many other European countries also, the same procedure is established because it ensures for us that the Public Debt Department is able to borrow at the least possible cost. And one of the mandates that the government gives to the central bank is that you got to borrow at the best possible rates to ensure that the borrowing cost is kept to a minimum. So if you find that there is a tendency for the interest rates to go up because of the auction, and that is going to be the higher cost to the government, then there are instances where we do not have we don't take anything at all.
Right.
There are instances of that nature as well, because when people bid too high, there are many instances where the central bank says we are not accepting any bid.
Oh, I see. So you've called an auction. You're dissatisfied with the rates.
With the rates,
too high.
We say we don't want it at all.
Right.
And there are instances of that time where the central bank will chip in and take some of the bonds, because not the bonds, the bills, because then the government will have the money, because otherwise government has to roll over as well. You know, it's a question of ensuring a cash flow. So the cash flow also has to be maintained. So in that sense, you would find that the public debt department takes that call, and of course it has to be reconfirmed by the deputy governor and the governor. That's
so to recap, this private placement is actually not private, but it is placed within the primary dealer system.
Absolutely. And also,
you didn't call your mate up and say, look, can you take so much?
Never. I mean, you don't call anyone and do that, because it's all open once again to the same primary dealers, and they're told, okay, we have space for some more to be taken, but this is the rate.
So, for example, if I'm referring again specifically to this last bond, the 30-year bond. If the weighted average rate was 11.5% and somebody had offered more money than was on the table, they could have said, look, we'll take the rest of the money, but we'll only do it at 11% or whatever the weighted average rate was.
I particularly do not like to comment on a particular transaction.
No, but I'm asking you the system.
Yeah, the system is that there are many options available to the central bank in instance of that nature for us. Now, if there is a bond which is out into the
so let's take this scenario, Mr. Cabral. We're not mentioning names, but this bond had 1 billion on offer.
Right.
16 dealers made their bids. 14 of them bid on the basis that there was 1 billion on offer. Two made a bid on the basis that there was far more than 1 billion. One of them made an offer for 2 billion, combined for 2 billion, and their proxy, another dealer, a state bank, made the bid for 13 billion in terms of 3 offers. The interest rate on one of those was 12.5009, and the others were all in single digits. Now, what would you have done in your tenure?
You told me it's a hot seat, now it's getting a little warmer.
Okay.
I actually would have done it differently.
Okay.
If we had asked for 1 billion and suddenly there was a call from the government to say they want more, we would have revisited the auction itself and informed all the parties that we want more. Or the most convenient avenue would have been, if, as was mentioned, this was money to be paid for infrastructure development work that has been already committed, and it was very urgently required, we could have easily asked the government to increase their overdraft with the Bank of Ceylon.
Well, the government has an overdraft.
Yes, government has an overdraft.
Okay.
So, because you don't really need to do a 30-year bond for that.
Right.
You can take some time, first take the overdraft, settle off your creditors who you say are very, very urgent, and then you can review the situation and then take a call as to what is the best instrument that you need to go beyond that. That's one option. The second is wait till the next week and issue a treasury bill. And then again you have space to go up to 1 year, and if you find that the rates are going up unnecessarily, you have the ability to then, in that case, ask the central bank to take some part of the money, and then you can retire that after some time.
So, just for sake of clarity, any paper that's up to a year is a bill.
Is a bill.
Anything more than that, it becomes a bond.
It becomes bond.
Right.
So that option was also available. And then that could have been easily implemented that way, which would have meant that, again, you have the time to ensure that you don't allow the interest rates to go up. Now, the significant part there is a call on the central bank to ensure that the interest rates are kept stable.
Yeah.
Now, here was a time where you have the interest rates gently coming down, and almost every single interest rate in the country was in single digits, including the 30-year bond interest rate. So there was no need for us to panic and to get more money in at a higher price.
I have a table here that tells me that the interest rate prior to this bond on the 27th of February was 8.85.
Okay, so if that is the case, it cannot deviate too much from that.
Right.
So if you manage that debt profile properly, now you ask me what I would do.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to disturb that too much.
Right.
So I would first take the first call by having the money given to the government in order that they don't have any crisis.
Right.
Then you review it. You have the options of having a treasury bill, or you have an option of having a treasury bond after due consideration by informing the market so that the markets are also aware. Maybe you might go for a 4-year, 10-year, whatever, so that you don't disturb the rate structure. Because you see, based on the inflation of the country and the prevailing interest rates, there's a certain yield curve that is established.
Yeah.
So the yield curve is the interest rates that all the instruments that have been given by the government are trading at a particular moment of time for us. So you can have at the one end of the spectrum the 3-month bills, which are only for a short term, and on the other end of the spectrum you have the 30-year bonds. So within this huge span you can have different rates of interest, but all are connected one to the other. That's the beauty of this whole exercise. That's why you call it a yield curve, and you can draw it and you can see how the yield curve moves at different times in tandem with the inflation of the country and other macro fundamentals.
So that's why the central bank has got such brainy people.
Absolutely. Okay. So this is very carefully managed. So in that sense, we could have taken time, ensure that the successes that we have had all these years, after a lot of hard work, and you can say interest rates are the biggest drain. Interest is the biggest drain on the coffers of a government. So if you manage the interest rates well, as a result of you managing inflation, then you have a huge success on your hands. Now here, what was critical was that our inflation was down. And when the inflation is down, you must ensure that you have that benefit passed down to the economy, because that's how people will do business. If you have low interest rates, people can do business. And one of the crises that we faced was the fact that the senior citizens, I'm also one of them incidentally,
are you?
were getting affected as a result. Now they were looked after separately. So you don't disturb the rest of the monetary policy with the needs of a particular group, and thereby you have the ability to ensure that your monetary policy is then much more robust, so that you can have a robust economy. Now that was the arrangement that we had, and it was essential that we preserve that.
Now, Mr. Cabral, you've been in the central bank nearly 9 years. I think you're in the top most people who, the longest serving group. You're up there, so you've obviously got experience of this sort of thing, and you are, as you say, you've been sort of hands-on. Can you tell us exactly how the governor of the central bank, or the central bank, is informed of the need from a ministry for funds?
Actually, the only ministry that informs the central bank is the Ministry of Finance. We have dealings about funds requirements only from the Ministry of Finance. There is what is known as the Debt Management Committee, and they constitute for Deputy Secretary to the Treasury as well as the Budget Director, I believe, and a couple of people from the Treasury, the Director of Economic Research and the Director Superintendent of Public Debt of the Central Bank. And they together are the ones who estimate the requirements for the next month. Actually, the government, although some people don't appreciate it, they work very in an organized manner, methodically, and there are certain procedures that are laid down for all that for us. And they assess the needs, then they make a estimate of which instruments to use at what time, And then that is also set out in a very professional manner, and that's submitted to the governor to get his approval, and then they implement that. So that's how the government works in borrowing money from the...
So when a minister comes along and notifies the Ministry of Finance that this is what they need, the process, I'm just trying to get the public to understand this, because it's not often that we are let into this little world. So the minister will say, look, I've got to make all these payments because I've stopped them, because I've been investigating all the costs. Anyway, I need X amount of money. I need 15 billion, right? So what he tells the Minister of Finance.
The way it operated during my period of time was that the request for funds would come from the Secretary to the Treasury.
Right. So and the Secretary of Treasury then informs you, the bank?
Not necessarily.
No.
He will only inform if there is a crisis where they do not have sufficient funds from the market.
Right.
And then they want a new Treasury bill to be floated to compensate the shortfall. Then they would ask the governor. But as I said earlier, it's all done well before.
Right, so not sort of some emergency...
Unless there is some emergency, and there are emergencies naturally, there are emergencies that came. I mean, during the time of the conflict, we had emergencies, and the government suddenly needs money. During the time of the rehabilitation, there was emergencies, government suddenly needs money. During the time of the resettlement, there was suddenly...
Right, now what I want to understand is this. The Deputy Secretary of Treasury will notify the Central Bank of some need. How is this done? Is it done by letter, by email, by
letter? There is a letter.
Okay.
And when it's normally addressed to the Deputy Governor, but the Deputy Governor normally gets approval from the Governor also to implement that.
Right.
And
so when these instructions, in whichever way, arrives, in this particular instance, we're told that the Governor of the Central Bank was present at this meeting. So clearly he would have had that knowledge. He admits to having that knowledge anyway. I want to understand the process. Now he is in possession of this information, and he returns to his office. And what do you do then? How do you communicate the need for this 1 billion or 10 billion or 20 billion? How do you communicate that to the dealers?
Now, for us, you are saying he and you. I'd like to have me.
Right.
If you ask me.
Okay, what in your term? All right. Okay,
I don't want to comment on.
All right. So when you receive this information from the Treasury, so in short, you get your instructions from the Treasury.
Yes, if there is a requirement for additional funds,
right,
that has to be a request from the Treasury.
Right.
Normally, if the Secretary to the Treasury writes, he will write to the Governor. If the Deputy Secretary to the Treasury writes, he will write to a Deputy Governor saying that they want more.
Right.
And then that is communicated
right.
to the public
so
department.
This is very interesting, because it goes to we're trying to show whether the Governor is acting arbitrarily or solo.
No.
No.
You never do that.
Right. So therefore, you get this from the Treasury.
You get a very clear instruction from the Secretary to the Treasury or the Deputy Secretary to the Treasury that they have a need for additional funds, and then only...
And then what did Governor Cabral do then?
Then it will be passed down to the Deputy Governor, who is in charge of the public debt operations, who in turn would communicate that to the Public Debt Department Superintendent, and they will then work out a scheme as to how this could be accommodated, and if by some chance the current instruments are not sufficient to accommodate, they will come up with a plan as to how it could be done. As I mentioned, there are several options: the overdraft, the Treasury bills, the shorter duration. All those are options that are available, and they will make a recommendation. Sometimes they will discuss that. Sometimes they will discuss that with the Governor as well,
right,
to see what is the best possible way forward, and that's how it will be done.